Welcome to the Institute. Welcome to a great presentation. It is by Dr. Timothy, and he told me how to pronounce his name because he said he's a pacifist, so it's not warring, it is wearing. He is an associate professor. You can read all of this in the School of Economics at the University of Maine, and also part of the sustainability group. Tim is here for a year sabbatical, so we're really lucky to have him in the community. He started as an evolutionary ecologist, and he's chosen a species of mammal to study. And that mammal is Homo sapiens, a human. So he's kind of jumped the fence from the ecological part of the sciences over into the social sciences. And we're really happy to have you here, and we look forward to hearing about how cooperation can be used to really make good, strong decisions related to sustainability and conservation and all sorts of things.
Thank you, Deb. That was a perfect introduction. So yes, I'm a sort of convert. I decided at one point in my career for you students that the studies that I was doing in ecology just weren't enough to save enough of the world, like my portion of the world, whatever it was, and that the problem was people. And so I had to study them, and I had no idea about people. So here we are. Thank you to the Institute for having me, and for the students, and to Carlos and Vern and everyone who makes up this community. Monteverde is very lucky to have an institute like this. So I want to start off by telling you the main point of my talk. I'm going to try to spoil it for you now. So I study social dynamics in environmental contexts. And the point of the talk is to suggest to you that we can strategically and intentionally use human cooperation and the dynamics of human culture to solve sustainability problems faster than they would otherwise be solved. Okay? And I hope that there is going to be something in this talk which is useful to you, and that you can then pick up and make connections with the rest of what you do. So here's the outline of what I'm going to present to you today. I'm first going to argue that sustainability requires cooperation in a lot of contexts. Then we'll talk about what cooperation is, how to define it, and talk about how it evolves. Then we'll use that as a basis for trying to think about how sustainability, and what I mean by that is sustainable institutions and societies themselves might evolve or not evolve. And then finally, I want to try to give you a recipe, because I think we need a recipe for building sustainable institutions and societies. So let's start with this idea that sustainability often requires cooperation. So what is sustainability? First of all, it's a vacuous term. It's a general term that is used a bit too much. So it's always very nice to define it. And this is one of the definitions that I like the most. It's very clear. Herman Daly was a figure in the World Bank for a long time, and he's an ecological economist. And his point was that if we think about the human use of environmental resources, a system can be sustainable, or that use can be sustainable, if renewable resources aren't used faster than they grow, and non-renewable resources aren't used faster than we can find alternatives, and pollution isn't emitted faster than it can be absorbed in a harmless way. So this is very nice because it's very concrete, and there are other definitions of sustainability out there which are much more general, much more vague. And I don't think those help us, because I take this issue seriously. But what's missing here is that this gives us an idea, a way to evaluate whether the human use of resources is sustainable in this context or in some other context. But it doesn't tell us how we get there, right? Why? Why is the human use of resources sustainable? We don't have a theory of when sustainability happens, right? And we need that. We need a recipe for that. And so I will give you one at the end of the talk today. So just for example, let's use Herman Daly's definition of sustainability. Here's a forest in San Luis. Majority of you have seen parts of this very forest. And so is its human use sustainable? There's a little bit of field down here, but the forest overall looks like it's quite healthy. So if we talk about the forest as a resource, the forest looks like it's being used in a sustainable way. Great, done. No, we're not done, because why is it being used in a sustainable way? Maybe it's just not being used, right? Maybe there's not a lot of people there. If you put more people there, then it would disappear, right? Or maybe there's a reserve on part of this land, and that requires a different explanation, right? So how did it become sustainable? It is. Let's look at a different type of resource. Here's oil. This is an oil refinery in California, right? So they are using oil, and oil is a non-renewable resource. So is this sustainable? Well, let's assume that alternative types of energy are not being put into place fast enough. In this case, it's not sustainable, right? So what does that mean? Or perhaps it's producing too much carbon dioxide emissions. So that's fine. We can say bad, but that doesn't help us. We have to know how it got this way, right? And how to avoid it, right? And what the social dynamics are behind that process. So I'm motivated in all of this because it feels to me like we're running out of time. We're taking up all of the space on the planet, and I feel like we need to be able to identify how human systems get sustainable, right? Identify the processes by which they become sustainable, predict when they are becoming sustainable, and help enact sustainable systems more rapidly than we are doing now, which is kind of like this, right? It's kind of walking in the dark, okay? So how can we accelerate that process? In order to be able to accelerate that process, we have to know when sustainability, and by that I mean sustainable society, sustainable institutions, sustainable behavior, happens. And my hint is that cooperation is involved. When do humans avoid overexploiting resources? Well, there are a couple of easy answers. One is maybe when there aren't very many humans. That's easy. Or another is when there are plenty of resources, more resources than we can use. That's easy too. Neither of these help us. The hard time is when there are lots of humans and there are limited resources. Right. That leads us to what I consider to be the best, most useful definition of sustainability, in a sense. Or rather, the definition of the opposite of sustainability, which is the tragedy of the commons, which is, for anyone who hasn't read it, a classic paper by Garrett Hardin in 1968, which is just as relevant, more relevant today than it was then. The idea of the paper is he explains a village in which there are a number of shepherds, and the shepherds are grazing their goats or their cows or their sheep on a common pasture in the village. Now, for each individual shepherd, it's easier and better to add more sheep, right? Because then you get add more animals, right, to your flock. Because then you get more meat, or you get more milk, or you get more wool. But if they all do that, and they all will because it's better for each of them, then what happens is you have too many animals, and the pasture gets destroyed. And then that's the worst outcome for the village. All of a sudden, no more economy, right? No more grazing, no more pasture. So there's a conflict between what's best for individuals and what's best for the group in terms of the way the environment is managed. Okay. So, but of course this can be solved by cooperation. What if they just agreed not to do that, not to add extra animals to their flock? Well, let's talk about that. We need to define cooperation first. Cooperation is context dependent. It only makes sense in a particular situation, and that situation is called a social dilemma. A social dilemma is a case where what's best for the individual is not what's best for the group. And the tragedy of the commons is a social dilemma that has not been solved. Okay, it's a failed one. Here is the simplest possible social dilemma between two people or two players, okay, in a game. And just for those of you who know, part of my research is I do experiments on my subjects, on humans, in a laboratory sometimes, where we have resources, simulated resources. Sometimes it's money, sometimes they're using a computer, and they're trying to manage the resource. But I have conditions where what's best for the group, that they both cooperate and they both get paid 2 and the group gets paid 4 as a whole, is different than what's best for the individual. It's best for me, if I'm player B, to defect, while you cooperate and you're basically giving me money. Because I'm putting more sheep on the commons and you're restraining, so I get the extra benefit and you don't. Okay, that's the problem. And that key factor, what's best for the group, is not what's best for the individual, is what makes a social dilemma important. It's what makes it the most useful social science concept we have, and it's also what makes it so useful for sustainability. So, social dilemmas happen a lot in sustainability challenges and problems. And I bet you can think of some. Before I put up some, can anyone think of a case where there is a social dilemma embedded in how we use resources, a specific case? Kate?
Well, one of the ones we're facing at the school right now is that the parking lot has gotten very crowded because everybody is driving cars. This has just happened in the last 5 years. And so the safety in the parking lot is not good, and there are traffic jams. And at the same time, our biggest carbon footprint at the school by far, it's at least 90% of our carbon footprint is that transportation. And yet people are reluctant to give up their independence sometimes, and they're also reluctant to pay the little bit of extra that a bus would cost if they're not going to be getting that transportation themselves.
Sure, exactly. It's a great example, absolutely. And I'm going to give a few others that are more general. In general, common environmental resources, whether it's a common forest, a common pasture, fisheries are almost always common property. Water in general is often common, a stream or a lake, the ocean, air. Of course, pollution is a common problem. That's why it's a problem. If it stayed with the people who made it, it wouldn't be a problem because they would solve it, right? Biodiversity protection, well, I'll just let Costa Rica do that because they have so much conservation going on down there. That's me not cooperating. And of course, climate change. These are all places where there are major, difficult social dilemmas happening in the management of environmental resources. So, and it's the most important and it's the hardest cases. Okay. So I hope I've convinced you that social dilemmas are at the heart of this. So sustainability often requires cooperation because sustainability challenges often involve social dilemmas. Okay. So if cooperation is the solution, then how does it work? Now, here's where it's going to get interesting because cooperation evolves. And I mean evolve in the sense that you biologists think about it, although not with the same mechanisms, not with genes. Okay, I will get into this in detail. But I mean it in the technical sense of the term. Okay, here is a refresher on evolution in the most basic sense. We start with variation. Variation in individuals. They have different characteristics. That variation is then selected. Some do well and some don't do well. You can see the ones that are the empty circles haven't done as well. Some die, perhaps. And then there's some kind of inheritance. Some of them reproduce, they reproduce. And so as a result, when we add these things together, variation, selection, and inheritance, we get adaptation. Okay? Now, importantly, adaptation is a process that always happens in the context of the environment, right? Evolution doesn't happen if there's no environment. There's nothing to adapt to. Okay. Cooperation evolves. In fact, we have math for this. My wife just recently advised me to take out the math that was on this slide. There was some really nice math. But I took it out, and it was a good idea. But if you want to know more about the math, there are sort of 5 rules, but 3 basic principles by which cooperation evolves, by which we have identified that it evolves. One is through the evolution of family members. Family members help family members because it works for evolution, right? Helping your kin helps your genes because your genes are partly in your family. Reciprocity is another way in which cooperation evolves. If I scratch your back, you can scratch mine, right? If I help Paul, and then if Paul helps Katie, and then if Katie helps Alan, and Alan helps me, then we can have an indirect kind of reciprocity, and cooperation can survive that way. The most important one, though, and the strongest one for our cases is going to be group selection. And so I'm going to explain what that means in detail here. Let's imagine for a minute that we have a population of individuals, some of whom are cooperative and some of whom are selfish. And they face a social dilemma over resource use, say. And then let's have individual selection happen. Well, who's going to do better, right? If individuals are competing to get more resources, to get more food, to get more wealth, who does better? The ones who are selfish, right? And so we get more of them. When individuals compete through individual selection, selfish strategies evolve, okay? For example, here's an example. We have 2 males. They're competing for access to a whole bunch of female deer, okay? They are not agreeing to take a smaller number of mates. Instead, they both want as many mates as possible, right? Now, importantly, the competition between them is very, very strong, and that's why they don't cooperate. Okay? Later on, if you want to, we can come back to this when we're later. We can try to analyze this and see how could we change it so that that no longer happens. What could we do to populations of deer so that they share female mates? Because there's an answer to that. Let's take then groups. Instead of individuals competing, instead of individual selection, we'll have groups of individuals, and groups of individuals themselves compete, and they undergo selection. So successful groups, well, guess what? In a social dilemma, what is a successful group? It's made up of cooperative individuals, right? So here, we've lost a bunch of groups, or 2 groups, that used to be filled with selfish individuals. And instead, these more cooperative groups reproduced or grew or took the place, right? So here, what matters is because groups are competing, not individuals, groups are competing, successful groups are being selected and spreading. We'll give you some examples of this in a second. But importantly, cooperation evolves in nature. Here are bees. You're familiar with ants, wasps, colonial insects in general. There are lots of examples of cooperation in nature. Group selection in nature, though, is quite rare. Group selection in nature is quite rare. But it does happen, and in fact, it's intentionally used to raise chickens. What happens when you raise chickens is you want them to produce as many eggs as possible. So each generation, the farmer goes and takes the chicken who produced the most eggs. And those are the eggs that they rear out for the next generation. Well, there's a problem with that. When you do that, you know what you get? You don't just get chickens who lay a lot of eggs. You get chickens who are very aggressive and decrease the health of the other hens around them by pecking them. They become very aggressive. The health of the chickens goes down. And actually, when you do that for a long enough time, the total productivity of the hen house goes down when you use individual selection. Instead, as is in this paper, you can read more about it, What you do is you put them in cages, and then you allow the whole cage of chickens that produces the most eggs as a group to be the parents for the next generation. What happens then is you breed docile chickens. They're nice to each other. They don't peck each other, and they produce a lot of eggs. And then the productivity of the whole hen house goes up when you use group selection. So, can we use that logic in managing the environment with humans? I want to list a couple of the things that make group selection faster. Having small group size, implementing some kind of punishment for people who don't cooperate, reciprocity, homogeneity within groups. If individuals in groups are facing the same situation, it's much easier to get cooperation to evolve. And of course, competition between groups. So, to conclude our bit about social dilemmas are a very special evolutionary phenomenon. They are a conflict between individual adaptation and group adaptation. Evolution is going in two different directions, and the question is, which is stronger, okay? So, with individual selection, we get selfish individuals. With group selection, we get selfish groups composed of cooperative individuals, okay? But in the real world, both happen, right? And so it depends which is stronger. Are groups competing more, or are individuals competing more? So group selection can help us solve sustainability dilemmas, but the balance of forces might favor selfishness. So we need to identify those conditions. And importantly, it can involve bad things too. Group selection isn't perfect. Group selection is part of what happens when people fight wars. In terms of sustainability, a corporate strategy to pollute so that the costs of producing the thing that I'm selling go out into the environment and other people experience those costs, not me, that can evolve by group selection as well. Before we're done, though, we have to realize that humans themselves were probably group selected to a certain extent. And I'll give you some reasons why. We form social groups very rapidly. Here you are, in a group, as students, in a group of people who I believe you're probably entirely unrelated to, right? But you're probably cooperating with each other. Here we are, you're all cooperating with me. Here we are using language, but really you have no way to know that you should trust me, I could be lying. It's a cooperative act just to sit here, right? Other animals don't do this, right? And there's a reason for that. It's because we've been strongly group selected to work as functional teams. We do it very well. And that is why we have become ecologically dominant. So we're naturally cooperative within groups because of a long history of competition between groups, right? The successful group will be the group that's more tightly organized, right? So this has positive effects. It means that we are naturally cooperative within groups, and it has negative effects, as you can imagine. Some of the biological adaptations to group life include nice things like we're docile. We don't have big sharp canines anymore like we used to. We are much more friendly with random strangers. We're good at specialization. We have language. We share the raising of our children. We can develop technology. Some sort of medium results of this, adaptations you might say, is that we tend to conform to the group norms. We care about our reputation. We care about our social identity. And of course, some negative effects are the fact that we, as a species, are ethnocentric. We are xenophobic. We don't like the other group, whatever it is. So, that's something we have to keep in mind. However, cooperation doesn't just evolve in genetic systems, it also evolves in cultural systems. And we're all familiar with this. But I'm going to argue today, and I can follow up with you later, that cultural evolution is a Darwinian process in the same way that genetic evolution is. There is cultural variation, there is selection on our culture, and there is transmission and reproduction of our culture. And again, just like genes, our culture is selected in its environment, right? So cultural adaptations are also a product of evolution with regard to the environment that they are evolving in. So, for example, the Inuits adapted to the Arctic culturally. They didn't grow blubber or fur. Instead, they adapted culturally, and that's how they can survive there. It's also worth pointing out that it's not really possible to drop one person in the Arctic and have them adapt culturally, right? It's a group-level process. They adapted culturally as a group, as a population, over thousands of years. The Kung in the Kalahari, in the same thing, have also developed social systems and technology which allows them to survive in their environment. So, as a result, we can say that culture is the main mode of human adaptation for the last 50,000 years. And it is why we have been able to conquer the planet. It's because we can adapt to any environment faster than any other organism, mostly, except for maybe bacteria. Right? And it's allowed us to dominate any ecosystem we come into contact with. So, and it relies on two key things. Groups of humans cooperating with each other through culture and developing solutions. So we can use this. So the process, though, of cultural group selection happens when, of course, some groups do bad things and it doesn't work and they expire. And some groups do well and they reproduce. It also happens when there's imitation between groups. The Monteverde Institute might imitate something another institute somewhere else is doing because it looks like it works really well, right? We can just copy it. That's what's nice about culture, is people don't have to die. Right? Also, migration between groups. Maybe people come here because they realize, wow, what's happening here is special, and I want to be a part of it. Okay. Let's take a look at this, though. Here's an example where certainly group selection is happening for both genes and for culture at the same time. These people are in the worst possible social dilemma, right? They're going to die. What's best for the army is that some of them die, but they conquer the other army, right? The army, what's best for the army is the army beats the other one, and that will cause casualties. That is not what's best for the individual. The individuals are facing very high probability of death. So what if this guy decides, well, I want to get out of here, I want to run away, just run over the hills, just turn and run away. He could survive, right? So why on earth isn't he doing that? Well, we've said humans are already cooperative, so that's part of the reason, right? It's easy for us to do this. The other reason, in terms of culture, is probably maybe he would get killed. So it's the same to him. He has to go fight, because otherwise he's going to get killed. He actually stands a better chance of surviving if he goes to fight. Well, guess what that is anymore? It's no longer a social dilemma. It's really easy. Fighting is easy. It's the best way for me to survive. The social dilemma has already been solved by an institution. Okay? Let's use this kind of logic to solve sustainability problems. So, group selection selects for group functional traits, institutions, behavior, and cooperation that solve group problems. Specialized roles, clever strategy, cooperation between players. So, a couple of things that also accelerate the evolution of cooperation in cultural group selection also include learning between groups and the institutions that are already there that make it easier for those institutions or those groups to compete. Okay. I'm eager to get to the point of the talk, so I want to summarize this portion. Sustainability problems, I argue, are often social dilemmas. Social dilemmas are solved through cooperation. Cooperation can be bred through group selection. Humans are already adapted for cooperation through group competition. But importantly, that wouldn't be so good if it was just that. Importantly, cooperation and cooperative functional institutions can also evolve through human culture. So now let's talk about some examples of the cultural evolution of sustainability. The best place to start, and if you have to walk out of the room right now, you have to stay for this slide. The best place to start is the work of Eleanor Ostrom. Eleanor Ostrom was an amazing researcher, and this list is sort of the distilled result of something like 30 years of her research, where she studied in India and Nepal and Mexico and other places. She studied people managing environmental resources in small groups, in villages here and there. And she asked them how they did it and what rules they had. And it turns out that when they had more rules on this list, they were more likely to be able to manage their resources durably, for the long term, more equitably, etc. This is the closest thing we have to a really nice recipe. I'm going to give you another recipe later, and you'll see why. Eleanor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize for this work, and I'm glad she did. She has one thing in her title, which was the evolution of institutions. She didn't actually explain how they evolved, but I suggest that a lot of these are culturally evolved group-level traits, institutions for successful resource management. And so to give you an example, from a place that I studied, this is Monteverde village in Tamil Nadu, India, where I studied for my dissertation. I studied the water irrigation system for their agricultural fields. This village...
Excuse me, can I interrupt? I was in this village for several days, and I painted about 5 paintings. I recognize that village. I can't believe it. Now I get an aerial view of it.
That's right. It's a beautiful village, isn't it?
I even remember going down some paths down here.
Yes.
And there's a main entrance street here, and I painted that street. I stood on that street. Couldn't believe it. Aerial view of where I spent several days.
Yes, it's a beautiful village, but if you walk on the trails, you have to be very careful where you step, because, and this is something of a social dilemma, they don't have consistent or good sanitation, and so you will find human waste everywhere. So, a social dilemma that can be solved.
It's several hundred years old.
It's at least 500 years old, that's right. Yeah, it's an old village.
Oh,
Yeah. So, this village has about 5 neighboring villages, and together they share a forest. Everyone in all of the villages uses the forest to get firewood, to cook, and to heat. And it's cold. This is a high elevation. It's higher than here, and it's quite misty and cold in the winter. In fact, you can see a lot of firewood here. You can also see the terraced fields. All of these fields depend on irrigation water that is collected from a local stream and then distributed in a network of channels to the fields. So we have 2 environmental resources that we can look at how they are managed based on what we know of how this system is structured. To think about the forest first, we have individuals within the villages. The problem is, all of those villages share the same forest. But all of those villages share the forest, right? So the dilemma about how to conserve that forest happens across villages. but individuals are the ones who need the forest to survive, need to consume the firewood to survive. So selection is on individuals. People who harvest more are going to be warmer and are going to be able to cook more food. So are you going to? No, they have to do it, right? They have no choice. And in part, as a result, we see that the forests in this area are not doing very well. So of course, when the dilemma is above the level of selection, just because this is a social dilemma, selection is going to favor non-cooperation. But when we switch it, right, let's look at irrigation. When the water in each village has its own irrigation system, and so what that means is the dilemma to share water for their fields happens between individuals, but it happens within a village, right? So yes, I might be able to get more water from you, but other villages are also watching each other to see how should we build our irrigation system, how should we make it work. And so I would argue that in some cases there is greater copying of successful village irrigation systems than there is cheating of water here. And so selection might, if selection were stronger at the level of the village, they could solve the irrigation problem. They could share water in an effective way. And indeed, they do have irrigation systems that are at the village level that do work, and people do share them. Okay. So this is one way in which cultural adaptations for managing environmental resources emerge. So in my work, I have sort of three major research questions. The first one is, when does cultural group selection accelerate the emergence of behaviors and institutions for resource management? This is asking the question for Eleanor Ostrom's list. How did those happen? Do we really know they evolved? When did they evolve? Can we understand how they evolved so that we can make them evolve faster? So along with some colleagues of mine, we formed a group at the National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis to ask this question: can sustainable societies evolve through the cultural group selection process? We start with a little simulation. This is just a computer simulation. I'll show you some nice pictures, where we have a bunch of groups, individuals in groups, and there are resources here. You can't see the resources, but empty space means resources. And each individual can either take as much of the resources as they want, or they can conserve resources by not taking it. Of course, if they don't take it, someone else can still take it. So it's cooperate or take as much as you want. They can also optionally participate in one of two institutions, which I'll just say are beneficial institutions. And they imitate each other. They imitate individuals nearby who are wealthy, who are doing well. Okay? What happens right away, of course, is the groups grow, and they fill up the whole space, and they start to consume all the resources, and then quite quickly they have consumed all the resources, and then when the resources are down, then everyone dies. And the simulation ends, and that's the end of the story for 90% of the simulations I run. And that's the case that we want to avoid, right? So we have to know how to get beyond there in order to survive. And we have to figure that out now. In some rare cases, there is a rare surviving society which has managed to hold on to its conservation behavior. And it protects its resources at a severe cost to those individuals because they're foregoing a lot of wealth and reproduction opportunities. But they manage to survive just barely. And then in the long run, everyone conserves resources, but they've basically equilibrated on a system where there are more resources per person, and it's a sustainable pattern. Okay. We also see in this little simulation that more societies survive when we have more of these institutions working. I allow them to evolve an institution or not. And we can see that it makes a difference. So populations survive when they limit resource consumption by the evolution of these supporting institutions. And so this simulation, this paper, is a proof of concept. that sustainable societies, environmental cooperation, and institutions which support environmental cooperation can evolve by cultural group selection when the dilemma impacts the group, when groups learn from failure, and when groups learn from each other. Okay. Second research question that I like to ask is, can we find evidence of this happening in the real world? So we have a bunch of examples here. Along with a bunch of colleagues of mine, Jeremy Brooks from Ohio State, we led a group of people trying to look for patterns in the real world where this has happened. One of them that I've been involved with my colleague Jim Atchison at the University of Maine, an economic anthropologist, is to study lobster harvesting in Maine. And lobsters live on the ocean floor, but they don't move too much. They don't swim like fish everywhere. They don't move much at all. And so as a result, groups of lobster fishermen can sort of claim an area, and they do. And they defend it. In fact, they defend it violently in some cases. And so Jim and I teamed up to try to study this, and we looked at the whole history of the lobster industry in Maine. And what we found was that successful groups were copying each other. And they copied each other, and they adapted to manage their resources by defending them violently. Right? Literally violently. Sometimes boats are burned. Sometimes, there are fist fights, right? Oftentimes, if you come into someone else's territory and put lobster traps out, they will cut the traps and you will lose your equipment. They also adapted and copied each other to set limits on how many lobsters you can harvest inside the group. Right? Everyone cannot put more than 100 traps or 200 traps. That's it inside. And that helps maintain their lobster population. They also copied legal strategies about how to keep other people out, and they also imitated conservation strategies, other ways to keep the lobster population going. Some of the key things that I think matter here is that lobsters weren't swimming away. You don't see this pattern happen with fish in the ocean, because fish keep swimming away. All you can do with fish in the open ocean is catch them before someone else does. And so what evolves in the open ocean is gigantic trawlers that collect as much as they can, right? Also very high stakes. The fishermen depend on this for their livelihoods, and also a lot of group autonomy. A second example from Maine that I have studied with my colleague Sam Haynes, an agricultural anthropologist, is about the history of the Maine blueberry farming. And so we looked across the history of Maine blueberries, and we looked at the producers. These are often companies that own land and grow and sell blueberries. What we found was, not surprisingly, those companies are in competition almost all the time, right? Selection at the individual level of companies is strong. But they did cooperate in two crises when the stakes got really, really high. The first one, which caused the inspection system, was there was a huge infection of, what are they called? Fruit flies. Of fruit flies, and their maggots were in the berries that were getting picked and getting canned and sold, and everyone in the United States started to hate. There was very strong competition from Michigan and from Canada, who started growing blueberries, and the value of Maine blueberries started to go down and down, and so they weren't making money anymore. And they realized, this isn't just a problem for my company, all of us in Maine are suffering. So they decided to implement a voluntary tax, and that tax went to a research station, which still exists, where they perfect blueberry agriculture, and they get just the right combinations of everything to make the blueberry production as high as possible. Okay. The key here being there were crises that made the cooperation happen. Okay. In Bhutan is a special case Some of you may know it because it has a famous development indicator called gross national happiness, which we all, or it did. It may not anymore, I'm afraid to say. I don't remember. It also has very strong environmental protections. And so a colleague of mine and I looked at this, again, from a qualitative historical level, to try to understand what happened in the case of Bhutan. Historically, Bhutan has a lot of different ethnic groups, and it wasn't unified under a single political unit until quite late, even for Himalayan Buddhist kingdoms. When it was unified, or rather a few generations after it was unified, the king of Bhutan looked at the other Himalayan Buddhist kingdoms. And he saw that Nepal opened its borders and was overrun with development and people from India and travelers, and that they had lost some of the things that he thought were important. He saw that Tibet had been taken over by China. He saw that Sikkim had been annexed by India, and I think in a very legitimate way was worried about the future of Bhutan. Right? Bhutan faced essentially an existential threat. Am I just going to get eaten by one of my gigantic neighbors, India or China? And so at this point, of course, it's a king, so the king just decides we're going to do something special to try to avoid this. And it involved two things. One, a strong sense of national identity. The national identity, though, was based on Dzongkha, which the king is, and that's, in fact, the language, the national language, and national dress, national language, national cultural traditions based in the Dzongkhan tradition. Unfortunately, that marginalizes some of the people who are not Dzongkha, right? There is a national identity, but it's not you. The other thing, of course, is also protecting the environment. It's part of the same, I argue, is part of the same pattern. In fact, there's even a little bit of suggestion, we haven't pinned this down completely, that when the king of Bhutan was trying to implement environmental protection, that he came to the case of Costa Rica and imitated some of what Costa Rica was doing. If you have evidence of that, I want to know. Because we're trying to find that link and we haven't found it. But that's between group imitation. That's cultural group selection happening. So, the point here is that you can solve these problems, but sometimes the way you solve them might be ethnocentric. So we have to be aware of that. Okay, finally, I want to get to the last research question. Can we design interventions for an applied science? How to harness cooperation for sustainability? So sustainable institutions evolve when there's a group level environmental dilemma. There are high stakes. Groups learn from failure and they learn from each other. And there's also peaceful competition. Right? If groups can take resources from each other, there will be war instead. So let's use this and let's try to turn this into a recipe for sustainability. Now, it's not a recipe that you can just build sustainability on your table. You can't do that. You have to grow it, right? This is a natural phenomenon. So first, what we have is we need to find a social dilemma for environmental resources. We need to know how big that is, right? What is the scale of that dilemma? Then you need to find a type of group that is capable, that is at the scale of that dilemma. Because it's at the same size of that dilemma, it can solve that dilemma locally, right? The Monteverde Institute can solve problems of pollution on Monteverde Institute land, right? Then you need a population of those groups. And within those groups, you want to encourage high stakes for successful environmental management, strong group culture, and institutions like Ostrom's rules. Reward cooperation, punish exploitation. And between groups, we need peaceful competition to protect and enhance resources, and imitation across groups, so that good strategies spread fast. So this is what I've assembled, and there are two problems. The first problem is in the case where there isn't a group that's big enough and still small enough to have multiple groups. When there's a global commons, right? We can't learn from other planets who have solved the climate change problem. And so, from my perspective, this is terrifying, because the only way that I've seen reliably so far in my studies that sustainable institutions and behavior emerge is through a process of basic cultural group selection. What you need for that is multiple groups. When we have only one group, we can't use that process. We have to do it ourselves, somehow. The second one is, of course, ethnocentric solutions. These are often easy, right? Close the borders, kick out the Mexicans, kick out the Muslims, right? Keep only the white people. Boy, this is easy. We can all just cooperate with all the white people. Those solutions might actually protect the environment. Maybe actually that happened a little bit in Bhutan, right? Perhaps Trump says, okay, now let's protect the environment. I don't think that's going to happen. But they're too easy, and obviously they carry significant other problems, right? They're simply unethical. But then they also lead to conflict. So there's more details, and I'm happy to share more of this with you. I have papers and things we can download and talk about. But I give this talk in general and talks like it so that it can be applied. And I've tried to make this as sort of portable as possible, so that you can see connections with the things that you study, the things that you work on. And so, you know, there are a lot of really hardworking people in this room who have been involved in protecting the environment in Monteverde for decades and decades. And so, you know, my Spanish teacher, Alan Vargas, had read this paper and figured out a way to apply some of these ideas to gray water pollution and to solve the gray water problem in Monteverde in a way that I thought was really insightful. And so, you know, there's some people have been involved in planning the reserves and making the reserves happen here. You know, people working on carbon neutrality. So can we use these? Can this help you in your discussions or thinking? Can I chat with you about how to do that more? This is why I'm here, is to talk with you all. And so we have a few minutes left to have a conversation about whatever it is you like, or to follow up on this with questions. Thank you.
I like see how it works. Like there's this huge push for like local, like small groups, like locally grown farming and like stuff like that. But in the scale of like looking at like the U.S. and looking at like the amount of inequality between the groups that would happen, like the competition between groups when there's like such inequality, like how would that work?
Well, so it matters what the groups are,
Yeah.
and it matters what the competition is for. And so part of the thing that I think economists often get wrong is to make the assumption that competition solves all the problems and that you can just let it do it by itself. You instead, as I think I have shown, you have to aim the competition in the right direction. And when you do, you can get it to solve the problems, thanks Ed, that you want it to solve, right? But inequality within a group is going to stop that group from cooperating, right? The poor people in the United States don't feel like cooperating with the rich people, and I don't blame them. They're not getting their fair share. But when groups are more equal, cooperation within groups is much more likely. And so, so that's one of the things. Yeah.
You said that like the existence of a global commons and a global social dilemma is scary because we have nobody else to learn from, but like also
Or
doesn't
to
that
compete with.
yeah, but doesn't that get rid of like the need and the inherent like existence of competition? Like why do we need competition? Especially since like you said like there needs to be somebody to learn from, but there's always like a group that did something first. There's always
Yes.
So like in the
Yes.
sense of a global commons and people having to work together, like
Yes.
as a whole unit, like why does there need to be competition? Why does there need to be somebody to learn from? Why can't there be intergroup cooperation on a global level?
Well, good question, and thank you for putting it that way at the end. The short answer to your last question is cooperation is much, much less likely to emerge when there isn't competition at the level above, right? So the easiest way to get cooperation is form teams and have them compete, and then the people inside the teams cooperate, right? That's the lesson, right? And that's fast, and it works really well with humans, right? And we've seen it work again and again and again, right? So I'm just saying the easy route isn't going to work here, right? Instead, we have to cooperate because we want to cooperate. But the problem is, nations don't want to cooperate because they're sacrificing economic growth when they decarbonize, right? Individuals don't want to cooperate because they're sacrificing, travel and fancy gadgets and nice houses, right? So selection is happening below the level of the dilemma. And that's the problem. And it's a big problem. Right? Can we solve it? Maybe, but it's not going to be through group level cultural selection. Maybe we'll make a global policy, but it won't be a global policy that is already nicely adapted. We might make it wrong because we haven't been able to watch Mars try and fail and finally get it, and then we just take the good institution and use it here, right? This is just like cell phone systems in developing countries, where they're able to just take the best cell phone technology, and now they have it. They didn't have to go through all of the other stuff first. Right? Yeah.
In a similar vein to what Eleanor was asking, I was wondering if with more egalitarian societies, because there's such little social stratification and more evenly distributed resources, if that directly translates to more cooperation and in turn a more sustainable communities?
To gloss over a lot of details, yes. Yeah, basically. The interesting thing about those societies, though, is egalitarian, small scale, usually hunter-gatherer tribal societies of history and also now. The hypothesis is they're basically working at the level at which humans evolved for tens of thousands of years. And so we're good at cooperating with people in a group of about 200, cooperating very evenly. As societies get bigger, stratification and hierarchy happens. And but then complex institutions also happen to enforce cooperation. And so really now we need to think about how, we're not going to get away from a stratified society with a global population of 7 billion. We need to think about how stratified societies themselves can adapt.
It was sort of on the line of that because you were talking about hierarchy, and I was wondering about decision making. Because I believe like that's a big issue with collaboration, is like where do the decisions come from? And also like in the structure that we have today, economically and everything, right? We use very little collaboration when it comes to decision making. And I believe that that's a really big...
Yes.
I don't know how to explain
No, that's a perfectly good explanation. I think that's, it's interesting because on one level, if you have a dictator, they just make a choice, and then that choice applies to the whole group, right? And so there are ways in which dictatorships can move faster, right? China, which is an autocracy, can say, we're going to do this policy, and it will happen very rapidly. And it takes a long time for democracies to get there. So in some ways, you know, having lots of people involved in the decision can sort of slow the adaptation down. But in other ways, it might be a more durable decision.
Yeah, exactly. When it comes to sustainability, I think that's when we should talk about changing like the way leadership occurs.
Sure.
More in
Yeah.
sustainability like terms than in.
Yeah. 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 And then we'll get Paul next. Go ahead.
So this kind of reminds me of the growth theory for solving the problem with externalities.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was wondering if that could be considered one type of cooperation, or whether it's like more incentive driven, or how to compare these two approaches.
Can you explain the question for those folks?
Yeah, it's a question based on economic theory about when to decide to not pay the full cost of, and I guess I think the easy answer here for in general is that the basis for that theorem is that individuals are always going to make the decision that is best for them individually, right? This is generally true, and economic theory is true in this one as well. So that applies even without cooperation. So I guess what I would say is there's actually more opportunity for cooperation, if we think about it in that way, in this structure, because we know that humans already are cooperative in groups. Okay, so humans are actually, you know, can be generous, more than standard economic theory would have us assume. Does that help? Maybe I should take this comment offline, because I think you have a good point, but I don't want to dive too deep for everyone. Does that? Let's follow up afterwards. Anyone? Paul.
A good example of the disaster of humans respecting the commons is when the Newfoundlanders managed to, you're familiar with the case of destroying the cod fishing. I don't know if there's any, you could make any comment of what could have been learned from all of that.
Yeah.
And on the surface, it looks like a complete disaster, and if you talk to many of these fishermen, oh, I didn't know that. They don't even get the picture.
Sure. Well, some of them even do. Some of them do get the picture, but have no choice. Right? Because they have to make
no more fish.
They have to make a living, and the only way they can make a living is go harvest the last fish. Right? And so there's a good example of, and I talk about this in the paper a little bit. There's an example of sustainable fishing systems, and one way in which you get sustainable fishing systems to start working, and we'll see how they go. Right now, fisheries are a global catastrophe. They're all dead or on their way down. It's awful, and it's because it's all a global social dilemma. It's a global commons. It's bad news. But within a region, you can start a sustainable fishery if you can come in, and for some group of fishermen who join, you can give them a premium for their fish if they agree to follow this rule of management. Okay, then the idea is their fish become worth more, even though they're maybe selling a little bit fewer. And then more and more people in the fishery join them, and that process keeps happening until you have the whole region. And then you have both the whole region participating, and you also have an ecologically based management strategy where you're measuring the fish levels and you're only harvesting sustainably, and that's tied to the certification. So again, it helps to have to use that competition, but you have to be able to have significant sort of economic power in order to make that.
Are there any examples of that actually happening?
Yes, this particular one is actually it's ground fish fishery in a part of, is it New Brunswick? Yeah, that's why I mentioned this, because it's in eastern Canada. So I can give you more examples. Comments?
Yeah, thank you for talk. I really appreciate it. And I want to go back to your idea of how systems evolve. Maybe thinking a little bit to Ostrom, but
Yeah.
so let's imagine we don't have that dilemma.
Good.
And there's
That's-
going to be cooperation anyways, but maybe not the kind of cooperation that you were talking about when you were trying to help us understand. But in biology, it's easy to think about evolution the way you presented it, but when you bring the social system, it's a little difficult to make the analogy, right? The biological analogy.
Yeah. Well, it's not an analogy. We're not using genes, but the evolution is not an analogy, right? So
Well,
yes.
That's where I am a little
Go ahead,
confused or
please.
hesitant.
Yeah.
Because without the constraint of this social dilemma,
Yeah.
I don't know if there's evolution in the way that you present it.
Good question. Yeah.
So, okay, so I wonder how much institutional persistence is avoiding that evolution from taking place, the kind of evolution you were talking about.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. So your question is multi-layers.
Those other institutions are going to be there, and they're going to say, no, cooperation is going to be against our own interests. And so these institutions are going to start to avoid the cooperation from taking place.
Right, sure.
Certainly under the social dilemma, definitely when there's no social dilemma. Right?
Yeah. So I guess so that let me see if I think what you're saying is that if social systems are evolving, even out and there is no social dilemma, then why would we have an institution? Why would an institution work, in a sense, right? I think in part, the way that I think about it is that institutions are ways to solve collective action problems and social dilemmas. And so, one institution is a system of tax, which enables us to do things we want to do as a nation, right? Churches have similar, right, where you pay a bit to the church, and then the church does whatever, right? And so, but that's hard to do if you just have cooperation, because cooperation is costly, unless you can support it with, we punish the people who don't cooperate, and we support the people who do, and we have a clear boundary about who's in and who's out. And so those institutions make it easier to keep the cooperation inside the group, I think. But I think you're also asking another layer of question.
Right. Maybe we can
later
follow up.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Because I'm very intrigued about that.
Okay. Sure. Happy to. Keegan.
I was going to ask a very simple question, but maybe it isn't the way. I'm just wondering how you define group, like with a common sense idea of what a group is. It kind of relates to what.
Yeah, right.
You're talking about the analogy between the natural and cultural.
Yeah. So I'm writing a paper right now, which is designed to try to explain in precise language how to study the emergence of sustainable behavior cooperation institutions from the start for researchers. And so I have to answer this question very precisely. The problem is that what the group is that matters changes in any given context, right? What the group is that considers itself a social unit might be different than the group of people that gets the benefits or costs associated with the behavior, might be different than the group of people that imitates another group of people. Right. And so just like in biological systems where it's really messy, it's often really messy here, sometimes maybe more messy. So the only way to do this is to figure out which groups matter in any given case. So it might be, for instance, in the paper we have one case where we're looking at examples of nations, one case where we're looking at examples of, of sort of evolution of sort of corporation and corporate strategy to avoid environmental regulation. Another case, so it differs. right? So it might be groups here, it might be municipalities here, it might be states within a nation.
Oh, sorry.
Let me give the question, and then I'll come back.
So
No.
in Costa Rica, a way to protect the environment has been proposed in ecotourism.
Yeah.
And I wonder if this would apply in some way that villages within Costa Rica would benefit if nobody else protected the environment, because all the tourists then would come to Monteverde.
Right, yes.
But within the village, so I'm just thinking if there's maybe a social dilemma there, and how do you see that evolving
Yes.
within Costa Rica? Whether you see the whole country turning green and then
Right.
distribute tourists evenly within the whole region,
Right.
or whether you see a few places turning very green and the rest of the place exploring other resources.
Yes. I think it depends a lot on the choices that Costa Rica makes as a nation, because I think there could be ways to encourage generalized sort of cooperation or strategies at the municipal level or the regional level to have environmentally based, ecotourism. But I think if there is no action at the national level, it's likely that a few places are going to start early and get ahead, like Monteverde, and will stay the leaders, and they may not be able to, it might be just sort of too hard to learn those lessons and to transport, how do you apply this to Bagaces or something? And so I think, part of your idea that I liked about the gray water thing is that, maybe there's a certificate that we could have of some sort. Maybe it would apply to, if you could get it to apply to hotels, so that hotels have a certain, a certificate for the way they treat their gray water, that certificate is clearly, it's the Costa Rican Sustainability Certificate, and it shows up in a nice glass plaque so that tourists see it, and then tourists pay a premium for that or something. Yeah, difficult. I know we're running out of time.
Okay.
Please.
No, I just want to say, because the whole premium thing is the thing that exactly concerns me. Because for me, for example, sustainability is becoming unsustainable for me. Every time it's more expensive to buy or participate in sustainability. So in the long run, I don't think many of these strategies that we're currently using for sustainability will be sustainable for and actually create a lot more inequality, which goes back to like your question, and I think it makes it a lot more hard to think about collaboration. Because for example, I love to collaborate with sustainability, but each time it's getting harder and harder for me to be a part of this, right?
Yes, exactly. And so another example I'm familiar with about this is, I think this is related. Academics often do a lot of travel, right? Sustainability scientists fly all around the world giving their talks to people in other countries about how maybe this is how we can be sustainable. But in order to do that, to fly to these places, to conferences and everything, incurring carbon. And so that's an example of, is the way that we're trying to do this sustainable? And can we change it? And but I think you're right. I think it needs to be, the solutions need to be something that can be accessed. As the cheaper we can make them, the easier they are to imitate and adopt, right? Thank you all.